Good morning. I was asked, I think, to do this for the English department, but also because if you watch Drake Bowman on Friday night, I am technically Romeo's more fortunate mother. As far as our guest today, Dr. Kilroy's most recent works include Edmund Campion, Memory and Transcription, the Epigrams of Sir John Harington. He's working currently on Edmund Campion, A Scholarly Life, as well as writing about Sir Thomas Tresham, Coded Emblems and Buildings, and about how Sir John Harington concealed his subversive transcriptions transcriptions of Campion and Robert Parsons beneath the mask of a lightweight wit, something of which I'm very familiar. Thank you very much, and Dr. Kilroy.
Thank you very much, Noreen. It's very great pleasure really to be here on Pentecost Sunday after that wonderful performance of Bird's Mass, which almost certainly came out about the time of Romeo and Juliet. Bird just moved to Stondon Massey in 1593 and was writing these masses, which were first performed probably at the Peter family at Ingatestone Hall. And I put on the wall behind a picture of Sir Thomas Tresham's building, which also dates from the same period, an extraordinarily coded building, which we might talk about during questions. And one of the reasons for putting it up is that one of the key numerological codes in this building is the number 7. All around the side of the building are the 7 instruments of the Passion 8 times. And I'm going to be talking quite a bit about 7 later in the talk. My reason for adding the pictures is that some of what I want to say is a quite close analysis of the text. And a friend of mine said this was quite hard for an audience, so I've put on a handout the text that I'll be talking about in the talk. And I've organized the talk in 3 parts. The first part is perhaps rather gloomy, focusing on despair. And the texts that go with that are on the first and last sheet of the handout. Has anyone got a handout? Cindy had hundreds of them yesterday, and I thought they were all coming out. Perhaps they'll come round, I hope, in a minute. And then in the middle of the handout, I've got a color-coded text of key sonnets in the play. So perhaps I'll start in the hope that the handouts will arrive in the nick of time, like the Battle of Waterloo. The first part of the talk I've called Lest Faith Turn to Despair. All things that we ordain in festival turn from their office to black funeral. Our instruments to melancholy bells, our wedding cheer to a sad burial feast, our solemn hymns to sullen dirges change, our bridal flowers serve for a buried corse, and all things change them to the contrary. A world of change where both words and reality slip from one meaning to another is at the heart of this play. Just as the word, well, perhaps the handouts are coming around now, so that's wonderful. And actually, as you're getting them, one of the things that I put on the front of the page are all the homophones that are, I think, at the center of the play. And the homophones are on eye, meaning ego in Latin, oculus, eye, meaning eye, vision, the eye, and then 2 more really, I meaning yes, AY, and AYE meaning forever. So the play seems to turn on these. I've tried to highlight them in yellow. The inside is color-coded and strictly copyright. I should say, are there any ambitious publishers here? I can't actually see all the colours, but I'm slightly colourblind. But I think there should be 7 colours there. Has everyone now got a handout? Wonderful. So the front page is what I'll be dealing with immediately. Just as the word I slides from I to I and I, so reality slides with scarce a moment's notice into its opposite. Not only light to dark, but woo to woe, womb to tomb, hate to love, faith to despair. More light and light, more dark and dark our woes. Men's eyes were made to look, Mercutio says, but what they see is curiously unstable in a play that seems as much about the limitations of our noting, seeing, knowing, as much ado about noting. This is a disturbing world where perception itself is unreliable, an enigmatic grasp of a reality that shifts between radical alternatives. Is it the lark or the nightingale? Is it Romeo or Tybalt who's dead? Is Juliet sleeping or dead? Virtue itself turns vice. Names, the primary method we all use to decipher reality, are equally slippery. Romeo wishes to tear the word of his name. Call me but love, he says, and I'll be new baptized, as if he is only temporarily represented by his name. By a name, I know not how to tell thee who I am, he says. The word, and perhaps even the concept of the self, the I, seems subject to change. I am not I, if there be such an I, says Juliet, whose eyes slip between 3 homophones. If names, nomina, are unreliable indicators of reality, pronouns, pronomina, are worse. The nurse's triple, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead, sets going 30 lines of radical uncertainty for Juliet, thinking first it's Romeo, then Tybalt. What storm is this, Juliet asks, that blows so contrary? Messages fail to arrive or deceive. The most important, of course, is the letter that Friar John returns to the sender. The critical failure of this message to arrive precipitates the play's transformation from comedy to tragedy, while the appearance of death brings about death itself. The instability of things is intimately connected to the slippery nature of language. We can see this when Juliet's most extravagant play on the word I occurs, and this is the section on your handout on the first page. Hath Romeo slain himself? Say thou but I, and that bare vowel I shall poison more than the death-darting eye of cockatrice. I am not I, if there be such an I, or those eyes shut that makes thee answer I. If he be slain, say I, or if not, no. Brief sounds determine of my weal or woe. She's been expecting good news from the nurse, only to hear first that Romeo is dead, then that he has killed himself, and finally that Romeo has slain Tybalt. Her expectation of good news is not the last in the play to be shattered by a messenger of bad news. Romeo, whose dream presages some joyful news at hand, receives Balthazar's news that Juliet is dead. But the news is false. What Romeo calls the flattering truth of sleep is more true than the message of a false reality that Juliet is laid low in her kindred's vault. The addition of the 2 lines in the second quarto where Balthazar explains how he came to know that Juliet is dead. Lines not in the first quarto seem designed to emphasize again the unreliability of visual evidence. I saw her laid low in her kindred's vault, and presently took post to tell it you. Sleep seems like death to the onlooker, but what we see in broad daylight is, in Romeo and Juliet, less reliable than our dreams. The children of an idle brain. Even though Mercutio may say that dreams are begot of nothing but vain fantasy, and more inconstant than the wind, and even though Romeo tells Mercutio, thou talkest of nothing, the play suggests that the world we see with our eyes is as inconstant and deceptive. Eyes themselves do ebb and flow. Both what they tell us and how we read that information are consistently and fatally misleading. The sense that reality itself is inconstant is confirmed when we look at Romeo. What's in a name? Juliet famously asks. And the answer in this play is a great deal. In an Italian dictionary published in 1598, A World of Words, John Florio, the tutor to the Earl of Southampton, defined the meaning of the word Romeo as a roamer, a wanderer, a palmer for devotion's sake. Florio's main source for this definition was Dante's commentary in chapter 40 of Vita Nuova, where Dante divides the meaning of the word peregrini, pilgrims, into its broad and its narrow sense. In the broad sense, he says, the word refers only to someone, in the broad sense he says, it means simply someone who is outside his own country. In the strict sense, he says, the word refers only to someone who goes to the house of Saint-Jacques in Galicia, or comes back from there. A second group, Dante argues, consists of those who go to Palestine and come back carrying palms, and they are called palmieri, palmers. Dante's third category are pilgrims to Rome, and they're called Romei in the plural, Romeo in the singular. You will notice that Shakespeare uses all three names in the play. I wish first to pick up what Dante calls the broad sense, and which Florio also mentions, wanderer. The word pilgrim, pilgrim, is derived from the Latin peregrinare, to wander through the fields like a stranger, to sojourn in a foreign land. And Shakespeare seems to intend this in his portrayal of Romeo. The word banished is repeated 25 times in Act 3. But there is another aspect that is central to our perception of Romeo. The friar calls him young waverer. Romeo is wandering, erring, wavering, inconstant, impulsive, moving from Rosalind to Juliet, from peacemaking to violent revenge, from faith to despair, unlike the description of love in Sonnet 116. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worths are known, although his height be taken. Since errare is the Latin for to wander, and bark is often used as an image of the church, wandering bark carries some sense of a church shifting from the true path into heresy. The wandering, wavering, easily despairing Romeo amply justifies the friar's critical description that he is a young waverer, as he weeps womanish tears, and his wild acts denote the unreasonable fury of a beast. He does not follow the North Star of love with faith, but instead runs himself onto the rocks. The most obvious and most painful for the audience in the final scene, this is most obvious and most painful for the audience in the final scene. And if you turn here now to the last page of the handout, section 4, back. This is a very, very long speech, usually cut. The scene is so full of action that we're in danger of forgetting the sustained interrogative contemplation with which Romeo peruses this face. We watch him gaze on Juliet's body, which we know to be still alive, and question the evidence of his eyes. For 40 long lines, Romeo notes the evidence that could have alerted him to Juliet's still living state, but fails to draw the obvious conclusion. Oh, my love, my wife, death that hath sucked the honey of thy breath hath had no power yet upon thy beauty. At the end of the Pilgrim's Sonnet in Act 1, Romeo had begged Juliet to grant his prayer, lest faith turn to despair. In the tomb, Romeo begins his speech in faith, but his speech is full of what this play describes as its opposite, despair. It is despair that makes him fail to read the living beauty of her body as evidence that she's still alive. Instead he asks, shall I believe that unsubstantial death is amorous, and keeps Juliet there to be his paramour? This is grotesque and self-contradictory rhetoric, a rhetorical question that demands the answer no. If, as everyone in this period knew, death is not, has no substance, one might compare the modern philosopher Wittgenstein's statement that death is not an event of life. It cannot be amorous. The speech that starts with the word perusing ends with a farewell apostrophe to eyes themselves. Eyes, look your last. Nothing could bring home to the audience more than this final speech of Romeo, how much our seeing is distorted by our fantasy. Romeo blames the external world for not telling the truth. Here lies Juliet. Romeo begs death to do the same. Death, lie there. Romeo implies that what Juliet and death do in this tomb is lie. But it is he, not in faith, but in despair, who fails to read the signs correctly. After the end of the Pilgrim's Sonnet, Romeo takes his prayer's effect from her lips. Thus, from my lips by thine, my sin is purged. In the tomb, Romeo also ends with his lips, but this time the metaphors are taken not from faith and pilgrimage, but from the language of commercial law. And lips, O you, the doors of breath, seal with a righteous kiss a dateless bargain to engrossing death. Death is a wholesale merchant and engrosser, taking man by the thousand, and Romeo signs himself away to this mercantile monster while addressing the poison in an apostrophe that highlights the moral significance of his act. The poison was itself a product of mercantile bargaining, and the apothecary supplied it illegally because of his poverty. Gold, Romeo argues, is the real poison. There is thy God, worse poison to men's souls, doing more murder in this loathsome world than these poor compounds that thou mayest not sell. The man who in the orchard had described himself as a merchant adventurer, ready to adventure for such merchandise to that vast shore washed with the farthest sea, now uses images of self-destructive shipwreck, desperate pilot, and sea-weary bark, right at the bottom of this extract. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavory guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks thy seasick, weary bark. Just as despair has made him unable to see straight, so his act now yields to despair. Romeo, young waverer, on being banished earlier, had despaired in the direction of the first quarto, offered to stab himself. The friar had been right to tell him to hold thy desperate hand, and say that his noble shape is but a form of wax. Too easily swayed, he had to hear a 50-line exhortation from the friar before he was calm. Whereas the kiss that concludes the Pilgrim Sonnet had been the culmination of pilgrimage, an act of faith. Every aspect of Romeo's final act of self-destruction is morally contaminated and contaminating. The gold and the poison turn Romeo's final kiss into an act of despair. In this play, where all things change them to the contrary, a kiss that is the first act of love is transformed into an act of self-destruction. Thus, with a kiss, I die. In moral philosophy, acts are determined by their intention. Faith transforms a journey into a pilgrimage, a statue to a saint, and touch to a prayer, whose effect the pilgrim can take. In the tomb, when Romeo meets Paris, he correctly describes himself as a desperate man, lest faith turns to despair. Romeo prays in Act 1, but in the last scene, his faith has turned to despair. Second part, I'm now going to, which is called Myself Becoming Traitor. And in this, I'm just going to describe a little the historical background. I started working on Romeo and Juliet by asking the question, what would the play have meant to an audience of 1595? I found a pretty good clue in a poem of John Donne's that describes the London of precisely that period. It's a very little studied poem, actually, called Satire 4. I strongly recommend it. Satire 4 is dated 1594 in one manuscript, the Hawthornden, when Donne was 22, but has echoes of the siege of Amiens in 1597, so its writing seems to span exactly the period of Romeo and Juliet. It portrays a London where the dominant atmosphere was one of fear. Donne imagines wandering through a London which is a purgatory, such as feared hell is a recreation to. There he meets a thing more strange than on Nilus slime the sun air bred, a man whose black clothes make him look like a Catholic priest, but who, like a privileged spy, tries to trap him into revealing his religious allegiance. He then has a dream vision of a court which is worse than Dante's vision of hell. One overdressed courtier whispers, "By Jesu," so often that he imagines that a priest hunter, a pursuivant, would have ravished him away. In two of the manuscripts, the text reads, "A Topcliffe would have ravished him away." In two others, pursuivant is glossed as Topcliffe. The cruel torturer who was said to have ravished Anne Bellamy and then used her to trap Robert Southwell at Uxbridge at the beginning of 1593. Vile and grotesque creatures in Donne's hellish vision of London appropriately plague each other. The last grotesque in this gallery has a face, quotation, as ill as theirs which in old hangings whip Christ. In this surreal picture of court fops and slimy spies, and men who look like the tapestry portraits of those who crucified Christ himself, Donne says, not surprisingly, "I shook like a spied spy." This poem is a nightmare portrait of a city divided by religious allegiances, full of spies, a city of fear. There was a very personal reason for this, I believe. John Donne's younger brother Henry had been arrested on the 29th of May 1593 by another persecuting magistrate, Richard Young, tortured and flung into a plague-infested Newgate, where he died almost immediately. The priest arrested in Henry's room was a young, idealistic William Harrington, in whose Yorkshire house Edmund Campion had written his Rationes Decem. Harrington was brutally executed on the 18th of February 1594, with Topcliffe ordering the sheriff to cut him down while fully conscious. No wonder Topcliffe was on Donne's mind in 1594, or that Donne, sometime before 1596, opted to live and abandon the faith of his late brother, his mother Elizabeth Hayward, his two Jesuit uncles, Jasper and Ellis Hayward, and his great-uncle, Sir Thomas More. The world of Donne's poem is a world of epistemological uncertainty, where nightmare vision turns to reality, where the observed observer, the spied spy, feels his own truth vanishing beneath a shifting reality. Listen to the passage where the spy lists the sexual proclivities of those at court. Who loves whores, who boys, and who goats? And the poet, as he listens, feels himself being transformed into a beast. I, more amazed than Circe's prisoners, when they felt themselves turn beasts, felt myself then becoming traitor. And methought I saw one of our giant statues ope his jaw to suck me in. The poet, as he listens to the catalogue of court gossip, feels his self dissolving. What the eye sees makes the eye dissolve. Myself then becoming traitor. The shifting and deceptive world of Donne's satire then elucidates the central pun of Romeo and Juliet on I. Outside the private space created by the protection of the orchard walls, Romeo imagines a world of hostility of Juliet's kinsmen, full of swords and hostile eyes. Benvolio tells Mercutio that in the public haunt of men, all eyes gaze on us. In a world where the evidence of our eyes cannot be trusted, we start to lose a coherent sense of identity, and the names we use to identify others to signify the other only distort reality. Just as Donne feels myself then becoming traitor, so Romeo is willing to change his name. In the stillness of the orchard, where Romeo comes like Nicodemus by night, his first words to Juliet are a request to call him not Romeo but simply love, and an offer to be new baptized. With equal simplicity, Juliet wishes to know, dost thou love me? I know thou wilt say, aye, and I will take thy word. Yet if thou swearest, thou mayest prove false. The eye of public discourse is unreliable and unstable. Like the inconstant moon, it is as superficial, as doffable as Romeo's name, with all its indications of religious allegiance and otherness. Instead of a simple I, Romeo is asked to speak, like Juliet, with the simple language of faith. O gentle Romeo, if thou dost love, pronounce it faithfully. Everyone notices that the play is concerned with love, but faith and hope are as important as love in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's faith from her earliest childhood is never shaken, Her I, her yes, is for I. It remains as constant as the vision of her I, and so her identity remains constant. The nurse's literally unbelievable account of Juliet's childish response to her husband, her triple I. Remember that the nurse says her husband said to Juliet, Jewel, and she says I. He said Jewel, says I. Jewel said I. It's quite impossible for babies to speak in this way, in my experience. Like the Blessed Virgin, her earliest words are I, yes, fiat. Juliet goes on believing in a reality, like the Blessed Virgin, her earliest words are I, yes, fiat. Juliet goes on believing in a reality that is invisible, absent, disguised, or submerged. Shakespeare gives Juliet the epithet faithful at the end, and she remains constant in the face of the same news that drives Romeo to attempt an act of despair. The nurse's answer to Juliet's question is confusing, but containing as it does a strong reminiscence of doubting Thomas's act of faith in Christ's resurrection. It's a vivid reminder of how important faith is. I saw the wound, I saw it with mine eyes. But once the truth of the situation is finally within her grasp, Juliet refuses to lose faith in Romeo, to wish shame upon him, to speak ill of him. Instead, she calls him her true knight. Her rhetorical hyperbole is used not to indicate despair, but as a token of the strength of her true heart, her faithful adherence to Romeo, and her unwillingness to turn to a new husband, Paris. Juliet only briefly flirts with despair in Act 4, threatening to use the bloody knife as umpire, but quickly recovers her equilibrium when the friar says, "Hold, daughter, I do spy a kind of hope," which craves as desperate an execution as that is desperate which we would prevent. The last adjectives applied to Juliet in the play are true and faithful Juliet. I want now to leave the inferno of 1590s London, a world of fear and epistemological uncertainty that Romeo and Juliet inhabit, and turn from despair to faith. This is the nice part. And the texts are on the inside of your handout. The Pilgrim Sonnet and the Orchard Scene. The first hint of an inner sacred world comes in the Pilgrim Sonnet in Act 1, when Romeo and Juliet meet at a supper. I'm actually very keen on calling this a supper or a feast. It has clear echoes of the Last Supper. But I think calling it a party, as people commonly do now, I think denigrates it a bit. As so often in Shakespeare, the supper has its Judas. Tybalt's murderous threat to convert seeming sweet to bitterest gall highlights the contrast between the disruptive effect of hatred and the still calm of love, as he, like Judas, withdraws from the feast. With a sense of a magical contrast, like the adagio in Mozart's Grand Partita, the next line begins majestically, "If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine." The sonnet, shared antiphonally between two speakers, is remarkable for its symmetry, the harmony of two voices. The octave, an antiphonal duet, is unusually composed of two quatrains, where the rhyme words of lines 2 and 4, "this kiss," are repeated in lines 6 and 8. These should stand out on the color code. If the octave looks like a diptych, the sestet looks like a triptych, since it's made up of a central couplet surrounded by a pair of antiphonal singles arranged chiastically, like a chi. So it goes R, J, R, J, R. The effect of this ostentatious symmetry is an aesthetic harmony that seems based on 7 pairs of hands and lips, and pairs of words by a pair of speakers. The sonnet is not just 14 lines, but contains 7 words that are each repeated 4 times. And I've highlighted these in different colours. I don't think they're all clear. I think the reds have merged into one another, but you can colour them in afterwards. If you look at these, I've listed them at the bottom. Pilgrim, pilgrims. Palm, palmers. Hand, hands. Lips. Saint, saints. Pray, prayer. This, kiss. Now, I think if it happened one time, you'd say, well, it's an accident. But 7. While its religious imagery is often noticed, I should point out that Shakespeare uses 2 of Dante's 3 names for pilgrims, pilgrims and palmers, and obviously Romeo is in the side of the text. There is no reference, the only one he omits is Romeo's own name. Every aspect of pilgrimage highlighted in these 14 lines was forbidden, and pilgrimage is intrinsically and solely an act of faith. Someone making the same journey without faith is not a pilgrim. Significantly, there is no reference in this sonnet to eyes, looking, seeing, or sight. Instead, the imagery is tactile, involving lips and hands. And of course, this may have a much deeper meaning, as Claire's analysis was suggesting yesterday, of the Church and Christ. Above all, the whole poem has a sacramental quality. It consists of actions that are all outward signs of inward grace. The effect on the audience of these 14 lines is extraordinarily satisfying. Shakespeare, in evoking the language of pilgrimage, was imagining what must have been a folk memory for anyone younger than 55 and a dim, if fond memory for those older. This sonnet requires both poetic and religious faith. It is required you do awake your faith, as Paulina says at the end of The Winter's Tale. I'll just read it through so we've got time to look at those 7 things. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this: my lips, 2 blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Have not saints lips, and holy palmers too? Aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. O then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. Saints do not move, though ground for prayer's sake. Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. The sonnet prepares us for the elaborate symmetry of the orchard scene that immediately follows. It wasn't called the balcony scene till the 18th century. In a play of continuous fluctuation, the most memorable scene is one of highly conscious stasis, when time and love are made to stand still. In one of the most compellingly static scenes in the whole of Shakespearean drama, Romeo gazes up at Juliet and says, her eye discourses, I will answer it. Juliet's first uttered word in this scene is I, me. This triple wordplay is no accident. Romeo's identity is the central issue in the dialogue that follows. By a name I know not how to tell thee who I am. Romeo's I may turn out not to be for I. Juliet's I, the yes of her I's silent discourse, is more reliable, more true than the public discourse, where Romeo's own name, his identity, who I am, marks him as an enemy. Only within the protecting walls of the orchard, the protected space, the locus amoenus of truth in a play of public untruth, misconstruction, and crossed purposes, is truth overheard and accepted, the self correctly perceived by the other, and the fiat, the I, the yes of love, uttered and understood. Only within the orchard does I, yes, mean forever. If drama means the performance of an action, this scene is almost ostentatiously without action. It's certainly without the stage directions that now litter a modern edition. It's almost at one point without the very lifeblood of drama, dialogue, as two people speak in darkness, not to each other, in two overheard soliloquies. On the other hand, the interiority of this scene, its sense of rapt stillness, is carefully and deliberately constructed as the dramatist holds the audience spellbound, even as Romeo and Juliet hold each other on the imagined silken thread of a falconer. The center of the scene, a heavenly dialogue of two starstruck lovers, is framed at the beginning by the earthly conversation of Benvolio and Mercutio, and at the end by the time-laden calling of the earthly nurse. Between these two, the dramatist creates an imaginary, timeless space in an hortus conclusus, whose orchard walls are imagined, which the audience is reluctant, like the two enchanted lovers, to leave. As Emrys Jones says in Scenic Form in Shakespeare, the way this scene conveys this feeling of a prolonged present moment is one of its remarkable achievements, and helps to explain why in performance it carries with it such a profound sense of occasion, one awe-inspiring in its beauty and poignancy. It persuades us that we are witnessing something happening now, in the moment of performance, something unique, marvelous, and tragically unrepeatable. From beginning to end, the scene is one of night, darkness. The word night occurs 16 times in the scene. The forward movement of drama is discarded and replaced by a magical sense of stillness, what Emrys Jones calls an extraordinary raptness. This is most noticeable in what feels like a generous addition to the scene when Juliet returns for the second time, and I think I put this bit on the third page of the handout. I will not fail. 'Tis 20 years till then I have forgot why I did call thee back. Let me stand here till thou remember it. I shall forget to have thee still stand there, remembering how I love thy company, and I'll still stay to have thee still forget, forgetting any other home but this. This is a still and timeless scene. Its static, intimate, and overheard quality makes the audience feel they are participants rather than spectators, as if we've chanced on this conversation that proceeds with all the randomness of real life. The offstage calling of the nurse is an unwelcome reminder of the unrelenting passage of time and of the outside world. If this is a dream too flattering sweet to be substantial, we don't want it to end. No wonder that from the beginning of their dramatic history, A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet seem to have been linked, and not just by Midsummer Night's Dream parodic version of Romeo and Juliet, Pyramus and Thisbe. Now I'm going to come to the part where I attempt some conclusions or an interpretation. And this is probably going to be the most controversial part. Aesthetically, the play offers striking contrasts between conflict and hatred on the one hand and love and harmony on the other. The elaborately symmetrical sonnet and the unusually still orchard scene seem to offer a glimpse of a prelapsarian world where voices are echoed and understood, a world that is critically outside time. In dramatic terms, the play has all the theatrical devices of comedy, but none of its consolations. so even the audience is misled. Disguise, misapprehension, and mistaken identity lead not, as they might reasonably expect, to a happy denouement, but to banishment, despair, and death. In philosophical terms, the play's investigation of the way we see things shows sight as peculiarly liable to error, shows names as semantically unstable. In historical terms, the play seems to reflect the violent religious conflict tearing England apart and confronting Catholics with a dreadful choice between pretending conformity or open rebellion. Finally, in theological terms, Juliet is more true and faithful in her disguise than the man whose name proclaims him as a pilgrim to Rome. She is a type, a saint who does not move, a fixed shrine. Her numerological symbolism, 7, is combined with a prediction that she is 14, born for sorrow, like the Blessed Virgin Mary, who has always been taken as a type or model of the Church. Teen was an Old English word, archaic, but still in use and found in the Townley plays, Richard III, Spenser. It means sorrow, conflict. The play continually associates Juliet with July, with the Julian calendar, then only being followed in England, and with Mary, whose age was supposed to be 14 when she conceived by the Holy Ghost. On this reading, and we can especially understand it after Claire's slides yesterday, Juliet could be seen to represent the Catholic Church in England. The most beautiful scene of received and reciprocated love is in the dark, a blessed night indeed. Love is not only blind, but requires faith. We have to become as little children like Jewel and say I before we know the significance. Be prepared to go underground, feign death, till better times arrive. Read like this, the play might seem to be a debate between hot-headed pilgrims to Rome, rushing into action or despair, ensuring the destruction of themselves and others, and Juliet, whose faith might appear to have died. Lying low is just a pretense put on by outwardly conforming Catholics. Nicodemites, I'm not going to use the word that luckily Peter Lake has now said we can treat as belonging to the conscience of the time church papists. It looks like death, the phrase repeated twice in Act 4, but beneath its appearance, the church remains alive, faithful. Faithful Juliet is willing to feign death, but only kills herself after Romeo's death. Those who are more ostentatious, whose impulsive mixture of peacekeeping and murder gets them banished like Romeo, achieve less and rush from one extreme to the other. Romeo's attempt at peacemaking leads to Mercutio's death. His subsequent rush to revenge leads to his banishment, and his despair turns banishment into death. The friar's sermon to Romeo, fond, mad man, is essential to the play. It's full of images of weakness and malleability. Thy noble shape is but a form of wax. It's also full of accusations of hollow perjury. Romeo has vowed to cherish his love, but is in fact killing it. His wit, which should be the ornament to shape in love, is misshapen in the conduct of them both, and is liable to destroy itself. It, and a very telling image the friar uses, like powder in a skillless soldier's flask, is set afire by thine own ignorance. The friar is uncompromising in his criticism of Romeo. A pack of blessings light upon thy back. Happiness courts thee in her best array, but like a misbehaved and sullen wench thou pouts upon thy fortune and thy love. Take heed, for such die miserable. The friar's accurate warning alerts us as to how we should read this play. If Juliet is faithful and Romeo is a fond, mad man, a desperate man, then the allegorical message of the play might seem to favor those who, like Nicodemus, conceal their faith, who refuse to marry the new suitor, a man whose very name suggests it is to carry off the bride of someone else, Paris. But equally, do not advertise their allegiance to Rome in their very name. Romeo's instability is fatal to himself and to others. In this play of ostentatious, symmetrical pairing, he is contrasted with Juliet's faithfulness, her truth. Yet even if her faith is in heaven, she's not willing to find a new husband, to conform to the new order established by the authority of her father and endorsed by the worldly wise nurse. Instead, she agrees to the advice of the friar. In the borrowed likeness of shrunk death, she will hold on, till Romeo can come to bear her to Mantua. Only the mischance of the friar's letter and Romeo's despair ruin this plan, rob her faith of its reward, and hand the chinks to despair's copious pockets. In 1596, Father William Holt of the Society of Jesus counts the cost of the mission. He writes, "Over 600 priests have been sent into England. Of these, 150 have been executed, 112 banished. Some have returned to England. 60 are still in prison. Many others have died after long labours. 300, he estimates, are still active. Even Cardinal Allen was beginning to doubt the policy." I quote from Eamon Duffy. By the early 1590s, Allen himself was in any case a disappointed man, aware that there was little chance now of a dramatic restoration of Catholicism. By then he was forced to consider seriously the notion, which he had half-heartedly canvassed in the early 1580s, of securing some minimal toleration for Catholics in a Protestant England. The play was performed 9 years after the Babington plot and 10 years before the Gunpowder plot. Father Peter talked about them last night. The experience of the government-inspired plot that trapped Anthony Babington and Mary Queen of Scots should have acted as a warning of what impulsive action could do to the Roman faith. The destructive despair of impulsive young men in November 1605 condemned English Catholicism to over 200 years in the tomb. Juliet is twice called faithful at the end, and a statue in gold is to be erected to her. Romeo, whose poisonous despair and lack of faith has led to the final tragedy, is given no kindly or redeeming epithet. The question, was Shakespeare a Catholic, may dissolve before the much more difficult corollary, if so, what kind of Catholic? It's not only that in this period, as Alexandra Walsham says in the book Howard Aiden was quoting yesterday, Reformation of the Landscape, came out this year, religious identity, she said, remained very fluid, but also that, as Peter Holmes has convincingly argued, Catholics fluctuated in their policy collectively and individually, trying now active, now passive resistance, now concealment, now conformity. Peter Lake, Michael Questier, David Mathieu in his work on Sir John Peter and William Byrd, James Kelly in an unpublished thesis at Queen Mary College, are all emphasizing how positive church papists or Nicodemus were about their role, seeing it not just as a second best, faute de mieux, but a better way of achieving their goals. Every sensitive and intelligent person was affected by the conflict that was tearing the country apart. Everyone had friends or relatives who had suffered. A plea to trust that the faith of England was not dead but asleep does not answer the question of whether Shakespeare was a Catholic, but it does tell us that in 1595 he was passionately engaged in the plight of Catholics and worried, correctly as it turned out, that their faith might turn to despair. Thank you.
Wonderful, Gerard. And I think you're so right in pointing out how he speaks to us through form and the rhyme deviation in the Pilgrim Sonnet of this kiss, and if you also look at the other two sonnets in the play, the chorus, by the chorus, there's also rhyme deviation in those, and if you put all of the words together in the rhyme deviation, it says, this kiss, fair air, swear anywhere. And if you put that together with the Pilgrim Sonnet, which is basically a confession, and the lips and the hands, and you use your lips and your hands to pray the rosary. And so if you put this together with the fair air, swear anywhere, this is really the exact message of the Jesuits and Henry Garnet in particular, and establishing the confraternity of the Rosary. And even though the shrines have been desecrated, as is hinted in the Pilgrim Sonnet with the word profane, how if she touches or he touches her and it profanes her, and she's a figure of the Virgin Mary. And so if you put all of this together, it is almost as if it is Henry Garnet's message that the shrines have been desecrated. You can still pray to Mary in the silence of your home. You can pray the rosary. And so instead of looking at the canon of Shakespeare as art, I think that we can really look at it as in part catechism.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think you make a wonderful exhibition of the other two sonnets, and I think all I want to add to that is that when I was working on this recently, I went to Krakow on the weekend just before the Pope's beatification and John Paul II, and the town, of course, was full of banners and flags and photographs. Huge photographs in the market square and all along the Palatine. And the one that I kept thinking about as I was thinking about this sonnet was the photograph of the Pope landing and kneeling on the ground and kissing the ground. And I was thinking really how, you know, the word kiss has that very strong association, which obviously we've to some extent lost. You know, it was a natural action for a pilgrim to make at a shrine. But I think I've also been very aware of reading Alexandra Walsham's book from cover to cover, as I've done recently, that as well as the desecration of the monasteries and the complete sacking away of the structure which upheld socially and culturally England, the abolition of all these smaller shrines and holy wells and must have been a terrible loss. And that very strong sense of Christianity, which came out in what you were saying, of Christianity as a tactile, incarnate religion, was actually deliberately smashed up, deliberately fragmented. And so I think that's why I'm very struck by the importance of touch in that poem. It's very, very tactile, and the fact that there's no reference to seeing whatsoever in it, which is covered extensively in the rest of the play, does seem quite deliberate. I think, and I think also that last line does feel very sacramental, doesn't it? It was move not move not that while my prayers effect I take. While my prayers effect I take. It seems much more like that. But I think the only thing I would want to say, I don't think we have to oppose art and the catechism. I think one of the things I wanted to do by looking at that sonnet separately from any interpretation was to say, look, this is a fantastically beautiful, aesthetically extraordinary construct, which, however you interpret it, is stunningly beautiful. The way editors pass over it by simply saying, well, this sonnet is full of religious imagery, and then they explain it in endless school texts as just another version of love, and you think, for heaven's sake, this is more than that. So, yes.
If Juliet is representing faith, how is she justified in committing suicide with Romeo at the end? Is this a symbolic kind of death, of the sort of despair of the Catholics at this time?
Yes. I was worrying about this as a possible question before talking. I think that the only thing I can say is that I think the end of the play is quite pessimistic, and people say, "Oh, there's a glooming piece," but it's a piece that is very severely hedged around, and I do think that that's the point at which she tips over from. I mean, she's not a straight allegorical figure. I think we would say that, but all I'm arguing is that she has very strong echoes earlier of a faithful church. But I think the ending could be seen as a warning of what could happen, and which to some extent did happen. But it seems to me that that's why I think the date of the play, and that's why I was linking it to Donne's poem, is very significant there. I mean, it's very interesting that 1594, the end of 1594 is the moment when Harrington decides to write his savage satire on the country, a new discourse of a stale subject called The Metamorphosis of a Jakes. And this is a text which is still listed in the London Library under sanitary engineering. But it's clearly an allegory. And the person, it's interesting, that the person the most significant marginal gloss, there are 5 annotated copies that have survived of this text, personally annotated by Harrington. And one of them belonged to Lord Lumley, very Catholic Lord Lumley. And that's in the Fulton Shakespeare Library. And the marginal gloss in print goes, "In memoria aeterna erit justus," an eternal memory will be the just man. And then there's a gap. He obviously got Richard Field to leave a gap in the margin. And in the gap he's written, "But not Justice Young." And then that's followed by the end of the printed gloss, "Tamquam stercus memoria impiorum," like excrement is the memory of the unjust. And you think this is what he is saying about these torturers, the slimy spies that Donne meets in the street, and the people who run them. So I think those years were terrible years. Walpole, Southwell in the Tower, Topcliffe, rampant, William Harrington, distant cousins of John Harrington, executed. I think 1594-95 were just awful time. So I think that sense that not that they were reaching the end of times, but something approaching it, I think would explain the end. But it's true. She does despair in the end. I can't get around that. I tried to keep it out of the text, but you're quite right. Yes.
You spoke of maybe the expectation that with a story like this, with a plot like this, that it might be driving toward a comedic resolution as opposed to the tragic resolution, and it does in A Midsummer Night's Dream with Pyramus and Thisbe.
Absolutely.
I've heard it said of Mercutio that when Mercutio dies, the comic possibilities and the comic spirit of the play dies. And I was wondering what your understanding is of Mercutio in the play.
Well, I would completely agree with everything you said. I think that Mercutio's death is clearly the turning point. That's the point at which we know this is no longer going to be a straightforward comedy. And I thought Zeffirelli's film, I think, caught that moment better than I've ever seen it caught anywhere. And that sense that up till that moment there's a sense of playfulness, and it might still have gone on being playful had things not gone that way. I thought that's beautifully caught, and also that is the moment, after all, at which Mercutio says 3 times a plague on both your houses. And it really, in a way, that's where I started thinking about this talk. What was behind, who are the 2 houses being thought of? If you sat in the audience in 1595, what 2 houses would you instantly think of? And if you were in London in 1595, I think you'd have, it wouldn't be a question. So I completely agree with that, but I think it's fascinating, and I loved, I'm afraid, Tom Stoppard's recreation of that moment. The first time an audience sees the play that doesn't know how it's going to end. I think right up to that last moment, you could think that it's going to turn out all right. After all, there's a comic subject, treated comically, there's comedy throughout the play. So it looks as if Shakespeare is deliberately shocking his audience. And I thought that sense that Stoppard created, it's always a question we've all got. What was it like to watch the play before you knew how it was going to end? But I think that the death of Mercutio is absolutely critical for that. And there are all sorts of other interpretations of Mercutio as what does he stand for? Who is he? I think one probably won't go into that. We could spend all morning on that. But sorry.
Thank you. Yes, Matt, one more question, please. Gerard, I appreciated very much your exposition, but one doubt about your critique of Romeo. Well, St. Peter was also wavier and also explosive. And the end of the story is Lammas Eve, the feast of St. Peter in chains, the name of the dedication of the chapel or church in the London Tower. And then Romeo bears the name of Montague family, Anthony Brown. So I think that if the suicide is allegoric at the end of the story, Romeo, let me keep my faith that Romeo is saved through Juliet to the higher unity. Because if their marriage is not only for time but for eternity, it would never be the blossoming peace in Verona. So I think this is my vision of this allegory.
Well, thank you very much. I think that I ought to add that when I was out in Peter's University, Masaryk University in Brno, we had a discussion with some of the students and about their reactions to sort of subversive writing, and one of them pointed out that there's a Dutch play called Is It a Bird? And one of the students was arguing that actually Romeo and Juliet were certainly better off than if they'd had a long, boring, bourgeois married life. And that this play, Is It a Bird? was actually attempted to say that they were still arguing about whether it was a lark or a nightingale years later. But to take a serious point, I think that obviously that there is some sense of a mystical marriage at the end. I don't think the all hope is taken away. I'm certainly not saying that, but it's.
Events will finally.
Well, yes. Perhaps I answer this question just about the buildings that someone was just mentioning. This is Lyveden New Bield, which was Tresham started about 1594-5. And the reason for mentioning it is that not only are there 7 emblems of the Passion going all the way around the frieze, you can see there, but the ends of each part of the cross, it's a Greek cross, have 7 planes of 5 feet each. And then the sides are 23 feet each. So the whole makes 81, which is 3 to the power of 4. And the 23 feet go 5, 4, 5, 4, 5. Again, it's a chiastic arrangement. And it's within a moat, which is 243 feet, which is 3 to the power of 5. And the 7 instruments of the Passion are repeated 8 times, as if 8, the number of the resurrection, trumps the suffering of Christ. And so it's an incredibly beautiful building in the middle of the Northampton. I know several people here have been to see it recently. And of course, this was the other building he built when he came out of prison for harbouring Campion, the Triangular Lodge, just down the road from Lyveden New Bield. And this is obviously a Trinitarian building. Everything's in threes, 33 feet each side for a number of years of Christ's life. And the windows are 12. 12 is the number of God. Tresham was very keen on the number of 5 because he said it's the number of Salus, salvation, Maria, Jesus, Gaude, and so on. There's the moat at Lyveden New Bield. See, there's a very good new curator who's been working on old records, including a Luftwaffe photograph he found in 1943, which shows the design of the garden. You can see here the Paradise Mound. So, this is the period when coded buildings and coded numerological language was being practiced. And this is an emblem which turned up in the British Museum, which I went to see, because I couldn't read one of the Latin inscriptions. It turned out to be Old French, actually. And just beneath it, when I got a stronger magnifying glass, was the name of the engraver, which was really exciting, called Romanius Hogenberg, who was an engraver of Queen Elizabeth, Archbishop Parker, and here he is doing an emblem for the most notorious requisite in England. And there's one of the gables at the Triangular Lodge. The Campion's arrival in 1580, windows of 12, and then Tresham punning on his own name, Tres, Testimonium, Danet, but also the 3 of the Trinity, obviously, and then 3 of the instruments of the Passion, 3 more there.